history of the Jedi and Sith are not separate, but dangerously entwined. Like two branches on a tree that threaten to break each other in their respective attempts to embrace sunlight and shadow. Some have speculated whether the Jedi and Sith can even exist without each other, but most doubt that there will ever be a peaceful resolution to their eternal conflict.
Nearly 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, on the storm-infested world of Dromund Kaas, one of the Jedi's greatest champions took on the leader of the Sith Empire. Known most infamously as Darth Revan, or Revan, the Prodigal Knight, and at that time, self-proclaimed as Revan Reborn, the legendary Jedi went toe-to-toe with Emperor Vitiate, the most powerful Sith up to that time. Through the eyes of Lord Scourge, an observer and participant of the conflict, there were several outcomes to the fight, but only one vision had complete clarity. And that vision did not see Revan as the victor, but another. Choosing the winning side, Scourge betrayed Revan, allowing the Emperor to defeat the renowned Jedi. For 300 years, Revan was imprisoned and sustained by Vitiate's alchemy. Though the Sith Lord used Revan as a vessel to empower himself, Revan's mind remained his own, influencing Vitiate wherever he could, staving off complete domination. When a Republic strike team released him from his imprisonment, Revan made it his singular mission to destroy Vitiate and his empire, but to no avail. Though his legacy ended in semi-insanity, Revan was still marked as one of the greatest Force sensitives of all time, a unique master of the light and dark.
Only I've been both Jedi and Sith, and found clarity in the Force. Only I understand him, and his death is my responsibility.
Several thousand years later, on the city world of Coruscant, just after the greatest Jedi purge known to the galaxy, an acclaimed Jedi faced off against another elusive Sith Lord. Known to most as Master Yoda, the Avatar of Light, the 9-year-old Jedi stayed against Darth Sidious, the most powerful Sith of all time, in what will be described as, quote, a contest between the most powerful practitioners of the Force's light and dark sides, according to the complete Star Wars encyclopedia, or a duel showcasing, quote, the full power of the light side and the dark side, according to Ultimate Star Wars. The fight was a sight to behold, lightsabers burning bright, Force lightning repelled and deflected, pods thrown from wall to floor, and a bout that lasted several minutes amongst the empty seats of the Imperial Senate. And like Revan thousands of years before, Yoda also failed to defeat his Sith adversary, electing to retreat the battle after falling several hundred feet to his near demise. But unlike Revan, Yoda chose not to pursue the reigning Sith Lord, forcing himself into self-exile until years later, when a new hope would find his way onto his doorstep.
If so powerful you are, why leave?
If these two famed Jedi met each other in open conflict, Yoda to stop Revan, or Revan to remove Yoda from his path, who would come out on top? For this video, I will be examining these characters as they appear in the Star Wars canon and Legends continuity. For Yoda, I will be observing him up into Revenge of the Sith, utilizing non-conflicting Legends material such as the Dark Horse comics, sourcebooks, and otherwise. For Revan, I will be examining him up until the Old Republic, Shadow of Revan, the Foundry, utilizing Legends material like his original video game and the Revan novel. Grandmaster Yoda was a species of an unspecified origin. Standing a little over 2 feet tall, his lack of reach and stubby limbs forced him to rely on his speed and dexterity. In his natural state, he walked a slow pace, supported by an old man Gimmerstick, wearing his 900 years on his sleeve. But it would be his use of the Force, specifically with regards to his Force valor, that would allow him to achieve feats that far surpass his years. Some may deny the application of Force augmentation in the context of physical ability. I, however, argue against separating the two. Unless a Jedi is facing a Yuuzhan Vong or a Torrent attack, unaugmented physical strength and speed is irrelevant. A Jedi's use of the Force and their physical achievements are closely intertwined. Anakin Skywalker makes note of this in the Jedi Path, musing that one does not need a towering stature when they have the Force to empower their muscles. In Weapon of a Jedi, it was Luke's surrender to the Force that allowed him to sustain a training exercise for several hours, when before he could only carry it out for a few minutes because he was using his physical stamina rather than his metaphysical stamina. One of the oldest things we learned from Star Wars is Jedi are
Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter.
Of the entire Jedi Council, Yoda was perhaps the best at applying physical enhancements through the Force. During a sparring session, while unarmed, he was able to evade Plo Koon, Saesee Tiin, and Deba Billaba, 3 highly skilled Jedi Masters within the Order, showcasing his masterful agility and timing. During the Clone Wars, Clone Commander Brolis observed how well Yoda used his body in combat. Facing against a Hellfire droid, Yoda evaded all of its missiles, but once the droid used his targeting lock, Yoda had to adjust his tactics. Instead of somersaulting away, as he did before, he turned his body into a corkscrew direction, forcing the missile to lose its lock, a maneuver Commander Brolis likened to a starfighter, much like we saw with Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith. The most fascinating aspect of Yoda was that he can go from being so frail to a whirlwind of destruction so quickly, with utter control. While it is true that one's natural physical ability is an effective supplement to Force augmentation, simply doing Force augmentation better is better. As Yoda would say to his students, quote, "Better than training the Force is, more than experience or speed it gives." And Yoda's colleagues knew this, even though he slowed in his elder years. As Mace Windu would confess, Master Yoda was second to none. No one could actually keep up with Yoda's speed or agility, not Count Dooku, a famed finesse fighter, or Mace Windu, a much younger and equally powerful Jedi in his own right, or even Darth Sidious, but more on that in the dueling round. Despite these showings, Yoda was not just an overwhelming speed demon, he was also a tempo fighter. Part of the reason he was able to evade 3 Jedi Masters was because of his measured movement, and one of the first games Dooku could recall with Yoda involved awareness of an opponent's pressure and balance. The game instructed countering your opponent, not by greater force, but by turning their energy against them, a game of nuance. But Yoda's tiny proportions were as much a curse as a blessing. His stature, coupled with his evasive speed, were difficult to make contact with, yet his stubby arms made it difficult to be effective in combat in terms of reach, which is why his speed was such a necessity. And his old age does play a factor in any long-form engagement. Though he did fight Sidious almost as long as Anakin and Obi-Wan, the bout was a cost to Yoda. It's like the aftermath of an adrenaline rush, or the exhaustion you feel after running a few miles. While the task is underway, it's no problem, but once there is a break, your body becomes aware of the exertion. Just by observing his physical anatomy, Revan does not look like much. He has a standard build and was not incredibly imposing or towering, more Anakin Skywalker or Obi-Wan Kenobi than Darth Bane or Darth Vader. And like Yoda in some regards, Revan has been spoken of as a tempo fighter. To understand the scope of Revan's use of pace and velocity, I turn to his contention with the Tionne. The best of the Tionne, as described by Chris Avellone, were able to predict their opponent's moves, sometimes minutes in advance, almost their own form of precognition. But the way they achieved this was by observing their opponent and their heart rate. Yet Revan was not only able to defeat them, but as Chris Avellone would say, hand their asses to them. It's my belief that Revan was so respected by the Tionne and the Mandalorians because of his natural and physical skill, much in the same way Maul took on Pre Vizsla, seemingly without the use of the Force. Revan was not impressive because of his mounting speed, like Yoda, or his dominating strength, like Darth Malgus. Not to say he was not fast, nor strong, but his strength came from how he used his body, rather than what his body could inherently do. Brianna, one of the Jedi Exile's companions, and the daughter to the great Tionne, General Usanus, says it best. When speaking to the Jedi Exile, Brianna made specific note of Revan's subtlety, his ability to weave the threads of battle. This was all grouped under Revan's immense stamina. Before you start shouting about video game logic, and that all video game characters look like they have high levels of stamina, it's because of gameplay, there is still an in-lore explanation. Revan participated in 2 wars, both of which he himself was on the battlefront. We know this from those who were close to him, who saw him fight. These battles were long and hard. According to Drew Karpyshyn, if Revan and Malak's fight had happened in a novel, it would have taken place over multiple pages, which makes sense with Malak constantly empowering himself with the Starforge. All in all, it makes sense that Malak would be able to sustain himself through long periods of time. even when considering the previous points about the way he uses his physicality. So comparatively, how does this pair stack up? For me, it's more a case of the early and late fight. In that way, I heavily favor Yoda in any early fight scenario against Revan, in a physical sense. He's much faster through his force augmentation, and he supplements that speed with nuanced techniques as specified in his games and lessons. No one in the Clone Wars time period, including Sidious, whose own force augmentation was equally impressive, could contend with Yoda's pace, and no achievement from Revan suggests he could do any better. Even his talents as a tempo fighter would not do him such good against such measured tenacity. But Revan does have an advantage in terms of longevity. The issue with this advantage is that it does him no good if he can't keep up. Considering Yoda's other opponents, one who was a master of subtlety and finesse, and the other who was the master of sheer resolve, I'm not confident in Revan being able to consistently manage Yoda as a physical opponent, by way of timing or agility. Yoda gets the edge for his physical abilities. We could spend more than an hour talking about every single instance of Yoda and Revan's combative use of the Force, down to every feat, passage, and word. To keep this analysis concise, I will be observing the most prolific and consistent of their abilities, attempting to characterize their general capabilities rather than summarize each piece of information. According to several sources, and I mean a lot of sources, Yoda was the strongest Force user of the Jedi Order, perhaps second only to the raw abilities of Anakin Skywalker.
The reading is off the chart. Over 20,000.
Even Master Yoda doesn't have a midichlorian count that high.
Yoda's potential in the Force was so immense, Count Dooku said that had he turned to the dark side, he would have annihilated even the likes of Darth Sidious. The extent of Yoda's sense powers were so potent, he could touch the mind of each member of the Jedi Order, and Yoda's willpower was unbreakable. Unlike a Jedi Master like Depa Billaba, whose sense powers were almost as impressive as Yoda's, Yoda never gave in to his darkness or broke down under duress. It's an incredible talent to know the minds and spirits of other sentient beings, but it's difficult to control. This allowed Yoda to feel all the deaths of Order 66, but still managed to remain in the present, and it allowed Yoda to repel Palpatine and Dooku's Sith sorcery. In combat, this applies to his defense against more esoteric force powers, but it also applies to his use of battle meditation, an ability that boosted the morale of troops and Jedi comrades, while dampening the spirits of his enemies. In a one-on-one engagement, the former is more useful than the latter, but all are an expression of Yoda's raw and applied power with the Force. Offensively, Yoda was a master of telekinesis. Even in his old age, well outside of his prime, Yoda could still lift an entire X-Wing. And during his time as a Jedi Grandmaster, he was able to lift 5 of the 7 stones of Muntor, each of which weighed over 1 ton, the largest weighing over 5. Even Dooku, who was the reigning master of telekinesis during his time as a Jedi, could not outmatch Yoda with his application of telekinesis. There is also the case of his showings during the events of the Clone Wars micro-series, but I generally take feats from this show with a grain of salt. However, this is all bolstered by Mace Windu's own musings, to which he says that the mantra of, quote, "size matters not," applied mostly to Yoda than any other Jedi Master. While I am hesitant on applying 2D Clone Wars feats, I don't have those same reservations for the 3D Clone Wars series, where Yoda still maintains a powerful and varied application of the Force. Despite this power and the ability to apply it, Yoda did not often use the Force offensively, more reactive than aggressive with his powers, using the Force chiefly
For knowledge and defense. Never for attack.
There are times where he does use the Force with authority, such as his Force push against Sidious, or against King Alaric's troopers, or against a Yanchori, but more often than not, he led his aggressive attack sequences with his lightsaber. When met with an assault, Yoda was fully capable of retaliating, and retaliate with dominance. In a more passive and general sense, Yoda was adept at Force Cloak and healing, but in terms of active combat, he had skill with Tuda Menace, outright repelling Count Dooku, and stalemating the powerful Force lightning of Darth Sidious. However, his Force wall has been breached by Sidious, though I do not hold this against him, especially when facing the greatest of the Sith. And further in the bout, when Yoda and Palpatine's fight turned into a battle of the Force, Yoda was not simply evading because of an inability to contend with the Dark Lord, but, as described in the Junior novelization, Yoda was arrogant and caught off guard after disarming the Sith Lord. Once that surprise had passed, he was able to retaliate. Yoda was the ultimate avatar of the light, the greatest enemy the dark side had ever seen. He may not have the destructive power of the Sith, but he had a great ally in the Force. His connection to it was so great, it culminated in his transcendence of the physical world, becoming a Force ghost and living on for many generations of Jedi to come. Based on the accolades presented by many of his contemporaries, Revan was one of the greatest Force wielders of his time. But what makes Revan so interesting is the praise he received from both the Sith and the Jedi. Johanny said that, quote, Revan was as great as a Jedi could be. Kreia added that, quote, Revan was power. It was like staring into the heart of the Force. These testimonies would be attributed to the likes of Darth Sidious, whose power was described as a black hole in the Force. Though it should be noted that Revan's power did cap out at Emperor Vitiate's level. Revan was so unique because he ostensibly mastered both the light and dark side of the Force, able to utilize Force lightning just as well as he can employ healing techniques. In the previous round, I classified Revan as someone who elevated his ordinary physical attributes with enhanced technique. While that applied skill is still relevant here, it was backed up by Revan's sheer presence and power in the Force. It's quite daunting when one looks at all the tools Revan had at his disposal. Revan was capable of telekinesis, Force lightning to the point of Force storm, Force drain, Force fear, and Sith sorcery among others. After his initial training as a Jedi Knight, Revan sought more knowledge from other masters, wanting a more complete and comprehensive training. These masters included Zar and Kreia, the latter a controversial Jedi, who would later influence much of Revan's dark side tendencies, and his final decision to defy the Jedi Council. Revan's use of telekinesis was by far his most viable combative ability. Not only could he utilize the standard Force push or pull, masterful in his use of a saber throw, but he also employed Force choke with no moral misgivings. This offensive skill was coupled with what most would attribute to his most powerful asset, his strategic mind. Revan had a powerful Force shield and a general resistance to domination, which is showcased by his ability to walk the corrupted plains of Malachor V, his use of the Starforge, and his 300-year resistance against Vitiate, whose power devoured those of lesser strength. This was grouped with his skill in Force deflection into the Menace, and too many others to recount. As Revan would claim, he received a new clarity in the Force by way of the dark and light, showcasing, quote,
I will show you the power of the Force in balance.
This culmination is perhaps best represented in his fight against the Imperial strike team on the Foundry. Yet this supposed clarity was also marked by an arrogance from Revan, that same conceit that led to his one-minded pursuit of Vitiate. And in a way, this would suggest a form of imbalance. Even so, Revan was still able to take on the entire strike team, using Force lightning repulses followed by a single targeted saber throw to contend with them. And when truly on his back foot, he redirected smaller asteroids in the Foundry's belt on top of his enemies, though he ultimately was vanquished. Overall, Revan was indeed a unique master of the dark side and the light side of the Force. His skill ranged from pain tolerance to healing, to the more dominating uses of telekinesis and Force lightning, a list of abilities and an application to use them that demand respect. A contest of the Force between Yoda and Revan relies heavily on how well Revan can cope with Yoda's power and nuance. Of the pair, Revan to me is more tactically inclined when it comes to his use of the Force. That's not to say that Yoda is without his own devices, but in a comparative sense, Revan is more dedicated to that mentality. If Revan tries to match Yoda blow for blow through his use of Force lightning or Force push or Force drain or otherwise, he runs the risk of opening himself up to Yoda's daunting response, either by way of his Tuta Menace or his own Force pushes, much as Darth Sidious could not fully dominate Yoda once they join in a Force lightning tug of war. And the ultimate culmination of Revan's combined use of the light and the dark resulted in what was basically described as a powerful Force push, or Force repulse, one that pushed back Vitiate only because the Emperor was attempting to dominate his opponent's mind. The result is not extremely impressive, and it ultimately did not earn Revan a victory over Vitiate. Revan's best plan would be to outmatch Yoda's abilities with subtlety and combination Force sequences. That again is truly where his strength lied, not in pure power, but in diversity of power. His Force lightning and his Force pushes in a head-on assault would not diminish Yoda, but applying them in an unorthodox sequence has a better chance of doing so. But even this is not a sure thing, as we've seen from Dooku's attempts to subvert Yoda on so many occasions. Even so, I do feel Revan is a touch more skilled in this regard than Dooku, making his use of the Force and his strategic play with it part of his very essence. With this, I think he would quickly take note that a head-to-head assault against Yoda would be a losing battle. but a constant variable and staccato attack sequence could wear the Jedi Master down. And in this way, I believe Revan takes a slight advantage against Yoda for his Force abilities. Master Yoda carried a green Shoto lightsaber, a shortened blade optimized for his height and reach. While Yoda was a master of each lightsaber form, like any other Jedi Master of his caliber, including the savage technique of Juyo, his preference lied with Ataru. Ataru was the fourth form of lightsaber combat, emphasizing the use of one's whole body. It was easily the most taxing of the lightsaber forms, as it required high levels of physical endurance. As Mace Windu would say of Yoda, his use of the form was an answer to, quote, the limitations of reach and mobility imposed by his stature. But Yoda did not use the form just out of necessity. He took it to its most elevated level, the pinnacle of its potential. Comparing his style to Hearthstone, his use of Ataru was like a perfect mulligan for an aggressive or mid-range deck. Or comparing it to Dungeons & Dragons, his hypothetical Ataru rolls were always in their high teens or natural 20s. This is also coupled with, what I believe, is Yoda's use of Soken, a sub-discipline of lightsaber combat that instructed the use of the environment. Again, this is necessitated by Yoda's small body, but the Jedi Master made constant use of the environment to enhance his evasion and attack. On the accounts of several Jedi, and the statements of Darth Tyrannus and Sidious, Yoda was the best lightsaber duelist of the Jedi Order, and quite frankly, the best lightsaber duelist of the time, period. The only other individuals who could fight at his level were Mace Windu, Count Dooku, and of course, Darth Sidious. Even so, Yoda has outfought both Mace and Dooku, the latter of which elected to retreat after both of their lethal engagements. Yoda's only true challenger was in Darth Sidious, who he also outfought by way of his blade. But wait, Antoine, that never happened in the movie. True, in the movie, Yoda and Palpatine's fight is cut short to emphasize the bout between Kenobi and Skywalker, so we never see Yoda disarm Sidious on screen. But when we return to their fight, Sidious is without his lightsaber. Where did it go? The answer comes by way of the novelization and the screenplay, both showcasing Yoda disarming the Dark Lord of his blade. But what makes Yoda so great? Why could none of his adversaries beat him by way of the blade? There is this misconception that he is limited by a textbook and predictable application of Ataru. Yet Dooku, who also mastered and had knowledge of all forms, as seen from his training of General Grievous, could not predict nor contend with Yoda, and neither could Sidious, because Yoda had fundamentals and subtlety down to a science. Yoda was like the Tim Duncan of the Jedi. Tim Duncan, who has been nicknamed as, quote, Mr. Fundamentals. Kobe Bryant famously said in his basketball documentary, Kobe Doing Work, that everyone knew what the San Antonio Spurs and Tim Duncan could and would do, but they simply had better execution at doing it than anyone else.
Because there's so much film done, there's so much scouting done, that teams know what you're going to run. But in this game, it's not knowing what you're going to run, it's how you execute it.
One of my favorite articles about martial arts, written by a gentleman named Myron A., illustrates the key importance of basics and the execution of those fundamentals. There is a reason forms and katas and sequences are in place to begin with, and that's because they are effective when studied over and over. As Bruce Lee would say, I do not fear the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. And we have seen this from Yoda's track record. Even someone who uses Suresu, the dedicated defensive form of lightsaber combat, would be hard-pressed to compete with Yoda, not only because of his speed, but because of his varied and unorthodox small man Ataru. Where fighters like Grievous or Sidious come in with overwhelming, one-directional speed, Yoda subverts flanks, constantly changing his attack vectors. Usually a practitioner of Ataru lacks for defense, but Yoda seemed to rectify this, much like Dooku resolved Makashi to work for blaster deflection, or Windu amended Form 7 to be used with Jedi Tranquility. Yoda evaded with deft parries and subtle dodges, which is best represented in the Attack of the Clones novelization. And Yoda's skill with defense didn't stop with simple evasion, supplementing his acrobatic dodges with standard defensive blade work, capable of engaging in strength-based saber locks. The issue with Yoda's technique, like his physicality, is that it is not sustainable. Granted, I think his levels of stamina are undersold, as his fight with Sidious is almost as long as Anakin and Obi-Wan's marathon fight, half of which turn into environmental traversals rather than blade bashing. But Yoda is very unlikely to carry out an hour-long engagement with someone who could contend with his speed and technique. The issue for everyone else is that most cannot contend with his blade work for very long. Simply put, Yoda was the true badass mother of lightsaber combat. Revan carried many different kinds of weapons during his career as a Jedi and a Sith, though in this video I'll be examining him with a single saber, just as we've seen him in the novel and the Foundry. Revan was also skilled with all the forms of lightsaber combat, but unlike Yoda, he could and did employ them all. As specified by the lead writer of KOTOR, Revan was more of a generalist than a specialist. And in his opinion, Revan would have been a specialist of Form 6, also known as Niman, designated as the moderation form. Niman was undoubtedly the most balanced of lightsaber forms. It bore no weakness, but it carried no overwhelming strength. This blanket form even makes sense in the context of the video games, where Revan has a varied skill set at his disposal, with very different types of weapon training and styles attached: single blade, dual wielding, or saber staff. And it was the use of this form which made Revan such an effective fighter. Revan adopted the best tactics from each form at the right time, defensive or offensive, and the use of the technique gave him options with the Force while fighting in active combat. This runs directly in line with Revan's reputation, which is noted for his astounding Force abilities, but also his mastery of tactics. He even expanded his martial skill from the standard lightsaber practices to that of the Mandalorian and the tionne, truly rounding out his combative flexibility. Each faction that he has faced against, whether it was the Sith, or the Jedi, or the tionne or the Mandalorians, they all held Revan in high regard, marking Revan as one of the best fighters they had ever seen. One of the defining characteristics of Revan, and a common theme between all of his iterations, is his passion. As a Jedi Knight, he was impassioned to learn all he could about lightsaber combat. He was impassioned to defeat the Mandalorians when the Jedi Council would not. And as a Sith Lord, he was impassioned to vanquish the Jedi in pursuit of the Starforge. And as Revan Reborn, he was impassioned to bring down Emperor Vitiate, even at the expense of other innocents. It was this proactive nature that made Revan into the fighter that he was, and it was the reason he was so varied in his skill set. As a fighter, Revan really did showcase his use of balance. In his fight with Malak, even though it has been stated by Drew Carbochin that Malak was a more talented swordsman, Revan was able to put him in his place twice through his cunning and his tempo. Momentum is another common theme with Revan. He's all about taking the measure of his opponent and subverting their openings, even when they have a more overwhelming offensive. This type of mentality was optimized for group fights, where he can determine the flow of the group and figure out the best way to manage the engagement. Unlike Exar Kun, another Form 6 user, Revan reacted, rather than creating his own openings through trickery, instead, simply flowing with his opponent. And the use of the moderation form would enable Revan's already ridiculous amounts of stamina to be that much more sustainable, as we've seen from his fights against the Dark Acolytes on the Starforge, or the Sith on Korriban, or the Strike Team on the Foundry. All are consistent with a man who truly knew how to handle himself and most of his adversaries. Of course, he is not infallible, suffering his own defeats, but these were against enemies of equal skill, more power, or more advantages. The comparison between these two is interesting because it's a matchup between one who is dedicated to a single technique, while the other is specifically dedicated to several. Oftentimes the criticism of Form 6 users is that they are masters of none, and they hold no real strength. But that's also their benefit. Because Revan does not dedicate himself to a single form, he is more likely to adapt and adjust to many different types of fighters, but he can also run into trouble when dealing with an outright and dedicated technique, such as a Dooku, or in this case, Yoda. The types of fighters that have a real chance to hold up against Yoda are those of equal tenacity, or those with incredible defenses. And as stated by the lore, Revan is neither. His dedication to the cadence of a fight would work well with most, but Yoda's mounting dueling prowess would not allow him to manage the fight like he might want to. Plus, Yoda's varied use of Soken, subtlety, flank subversion, and unique Shoto-based Ataru would be add-ons too atypical to deal with. As I believe Revan would quickly deduce, his real hope would be to hold out and wait for Yoda's assault to slow. His use of the Force might also help to bridge the gap, if not his dueling abilities. But this round is an examination of each combatant as a lightsaber duelist, and even the integration of Force powers is not a sure thing, at least not enough to sway things into his favor, majority of the time. Yoda gets the edge for his dueling abilities. So Yoda against Revan, the Grand Master versus the Reborn. Both failed to vanquish the Dark Lords of their time, but if the pair lived in the same time period, Yoda during the Old Republic, or Revan during the Clone Wars, if, for whatever reason, they met in open conflict, both trying to stop the other, who would more likely come out victorious? Let's set up this fight. Let's say it takes place in the Jedi Temple ruins of Jedha. The following is a hypothetical explanation of the possible outcomes. The early fight would see Yoda coming out aggressive, utilizing his astounding speed to breach the gap between himself and Revan. Revan would spend much of this early bout taking a measure of Yoda and his abilities, but he would quickly find himself trying to bat the Jedi Master's attacks away, rather than crafting his own plan of action. Yoda would keep pressing his attacks, using the rocks to flank Revan, while using his deft blade work to cut through his guard. In this early engagement, I see Yoda taking a very comfortable 3-0 advantage. There aren't many scenarios where I can see Revan coming out of the gate to match Yoda's initial assault. But based on Revan's accolades around his reflex and his Tionne training, I think he could at least contend and ward Yoda off. But he would not be able to control the engagement as a Form 6 user would like to do. Plus, Revan's typical mode of operation was not to come out sprinting, which also hurts his favor in any early fight arrangement. More often than not, I see Yoda outmatching Revan's momentum and tempo, disarming the reborn Jedi, or finding a slit in his defenses that can be exploited by Yoda's Shoto-based Ataru. But if Revan can keep up with this initial assault, I think he would try to retaliate with his Force powers. This could happen in a number of ways, either by way of his Force Lightning, a series of Force pushes, or, as we saw in the novel, a combined use of the light and dark side. I think Revan will be able to sense the great power within Yoda, knowing that something like Force Drain, or Force Fear, or any form of mind domination would do no good. It's likely that he would use the combined use of the Force, as he did against Vitiate, and in this way, it could certainly blow Yoda back, halting his assault. But once the initial surprise of the attack was revealed, Yoda would more readily counter. If Revan were to follow up with lightning, for instance, Yoda would catch and repel it, as he did with Sidious. If Revan were to follow up with a Force push, even one not directly targeted at Yoda, but for instance, at a fallen stone nearby, Yoda would neatly dodge and counter with his own sequence, as he did with Dooku. In the mid-range fight, I think Revan would start matching Yoda, but the Jedi Master would still hold the advantage. Yoda's assault would slow, applying less pressure with his lightsaber, but he would still be capable of impeding Revan's Force abilities, and then, in turn, turning them back at the reborn Jedi. And once that advantage was found, again, Yoda could disarm Revan with his blade work, or disable him with his own telekinetic offensive, though far less likely than what was presented in the early fight. The late fight is where the advantages would completely turn, for two reasons. 1. Revan is far more sustainable in a war of attrition than Yoda. 2. Revan's tactics, now with Yoda's slowed assault, could more easily and effectively be applied. And on top of that, Revan would fully have a measure of Yoda. Instead of trying to match him blow for blow, or even trying to directly outmatch his finesse, Revan would have started applying his diverse abilities with a less forceful and more staccato sequence. A quick Force push, followed by a saber throw, and then a single spurt of lightning, all in quick succession, avoiding the predictable and the powerful, and using the unorthodox and the quick, wearing the Jedi Master down. In the late fight, I think it is Revan who would take the shutout 2-0 advantage. Yoda's technique, by definition within the lore, would not be able to sustain itself in such a long-form engagement. And while it would still be a difficult effort for Revan to overcome the Jedi Master, the late fight is, in a sense, his home court advantage. Yet of all the most likely scenarios, I think this matchup ends somewhere between the early and mid-range fight, with Revan not quite being able to keep up long enough before Yoda slows in the late fight scenarios. Revan fights by way of flowing and anticipating his opponents, outmatching their tempo. But in these early fight scenarios, he would not be able to apply this advantage against Yoda. Instead of flowing, simply keeping up, much in the same way Dooku's style had to adjust to Yoda, rather than the other way around, or how Sidious could not keep up through his own adjustments. and when attempting to retaliate with his Force powers, the initial outcome would be those abilities thrown back in his face, either through power or finesse. And thus, after a 6-10 advantage, Yoda, the Grand Master of the Jedi Order, the Avatar of Light, would be the most likely victor. Of course, this is all my opinion based on the lore of Star Wars. Do you agree that Yoda would take a majority victory, or do you believe the Reborn Jedi is the most likely victor? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, peace, love, and may the Force be with you. Always.